Should I start?
Yeah, we'll just give.
Yeah. Hello, welcome to Woolwich Contemporary Print Fair. My name's Lizzie Glendinning and I'm the curator of Woolwich. I'm joined today by Mollie Barnes of She Curates, which is a blog and Instagram platform that celebrates and champions women artists, and also sort of researches and looks at women's place within art history. Mollie's kindly facilitated this panel to discuss women's place in print, and I'll hand over to Mollie to do a short introduction, and then I'll introduce you to the artists that are joining us today. We have a presentation that's running alongside, and then the artists will introduce themselves, and then Mollie will ask questions, and we'll just have a sort of organic conversation about women in print. So if I hand over to Mollie.
Brilliant, thank you, Lizzie. So yeah, like Lizzie, before Lizzie introduced each member of our panel, I wanted to say a little bit about the themes and ideas that we're going to run through in this discussion. So she said, I'm Mollie, I run She Curates. I'm a curator and a freelancer in the art world, and I launched She Curates on Instagram to document my curatorial practice, but also to celebrate women artists, and it's just grown, and I'm so lucky to be here today with all of you. I feel like we've been looking forward to this panel for years, but I think that's just the nature of the pandemic. So I'm really, really pleased to be here with you all today. So the panel is going to be broadly split into two key areas. The first will be exploring the history of printmaking, but more specifically, the history of women in printmaking, as women have been active in this medium almost as long as its origin as an art form. But even today, men are considered widely to have the broad monopoly on it as a creative venture and a profession. As is all too often, women artists have been overshadowed by their male counterparts. So we're going to be addressing that. And the other side of the discussion is about how printmaking has long been overshadowed by the painted picture or sculptural works. It's as fine as an art as any other, taking extreme patience, care and time. And we're going to be exploring the reasons behind this shift, the history and commerciality of printmaking, and also the notions behind this underdog of the art world. So I'm really, really pleased to get started.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Mollie. And I'll just give a brief introduction to each artist, and then maybe they could give a more detailed introduction to themselves before we crack on. So we've got Jen Moore here. Oh, sorry, Amy Jane Blackhall, thank you. So Amy's shown with us for a number of years, and her work focuses on the physical and spiritual active making. Can we have the next slide? Jen Moore, oh sorry, maybe you want to talk about your work as the slides come up. So if I hand over to Amy Jane and then we can do each one, that would make more sense.
Yeah, I'm Amy Jane Blackhall. I've been making prints for over 10 years now, and I set up my own print studio in 2016 in Press. So I spend a large amount of my time working collaboratively with artists to make fine art print editions, and then I kind of work alongside developing my own practice, and I work in like lots of different print processes. I like kind of blending them together and kind of making things probably more, I like the kind of experimental nature of print, and then sort of containing it really, and I like it that they sort of transcend the print border and boundaries.
Thank you very much. Can we have the next slide, please?
Hi. Yeah, I'm Jen Moore. I'm relatively new to printmaking. So I originally trained as an architect and practiced as one for some time. And the last few years, I took sort of smaller printmaking courses. I was just intrigued about the mark making, the drawing, and just learning about the process because there's so much to learn. And recently, I've started an MA in printmaking at UAL, and I'm sort of halfway through that. And yeah, so I'm just still exploring my things, but I'm really interested in space and place, and how we measure and how we survey space, and also how it feels to experience it. So on these two that I've got at Woolwich, they relate to a particular place, Elephant Castle, though they're quite abstracted. There's elements of those sites, so I'm trying to be quite site specific with my work. Thanks.
So Kristina Chan, So you, Kristina, looks at the sort of traditional narrative, but then works in sort of the photographs as well. She's got 4 pieces, I believe, independently within the fair, but she also has a collaborative piece as well with Itamar Fried. Kristina, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Lizzie. Yes, so I work a lot with photography and with alternative photography, looking at kind of how to stretch these so-called traditional processes and bring them into today. Like, I feel one of my major issues with printmaking is that people still think it is kind of set in the past, but it isn't. And I like really playing around with that, and even with my photography, kind of either displacing it in time, pushing it back to kind of exacerbate this stereotype and therefore kind of combat it, or, you know, in a way make something very vague so it can't be placed, or completely kind of upset context in a way. And in that way I work a lot with narrative and a lot with place, and so my work tends to follow kind of different collections based on different places. And I have my own practice, and before I moved to the UK, I was an editioner as well throughout Paris and South Africa, working a lot with other artists and enjoying the kind of collaboration and the discussion of the process, and this very, very group mentality, but also very much this storytelling aspect of print and how we get there, both in plate making and in the work itself.
Thank you. Yoonjung Shim. Yoonjung's shown with us for a number of years, I think 2 or 3 years, and I'm really drawn to the sort of geometric architectural forms within her work. Could you tell us a bit more about your process?
Oh, yes. Hi, I'm Yoonjung, and my background is more in design, especially interior design, because I work as an interior designer. So as an interior designer, I was always very interested in art. After choosing an artwork for a space is really the climax of interior decoration. So the decoration can never really be finished without an artwork on the wall. So I have always been drawn to abstract patterns, whether it's on the fabrics or any other in design. So I became interested in printmaking because I found it to be a very effective medium to transform these patterns in monotone onto the paper and finally on the wall. So yes, so that's why I became a printmaker, and yes, especially etching can make it happen. So that's how I'm here now, an immigrant from the interior designer. So yes, that's all.
Brilliant. Thank you all so much for introducing yourselves. Before I hand over to Mollie, I just want to say that we're very lucky with the Woolwich Contemporary Print Fair because we operate an international open call, but the selection's completely blind and it's only based on the work. So we're really lucky that we have such a strong women artist contingent and some really beautiful works by women printmakers. So I'm going to hand over to Mollie now to lead our discussion, and I'm really excited about the content that comes out of it, and also hopefully that those that are watching, maybe you can go back into the fair after our discussion and maybe look at the works in a new light, or with a new sight maybe. Yeah, okay, go for it, Mollie.
So just before we start, I was going to say, everyone can see at the bottom, there's a little Q&A section. So if you have any questions throughout the discussion, please put them in there and we'll be monitoring them throughout. But I think we should just dive right in and start with why the panel believes that printmaking has historically been seen as a male medium. And I think there's loads of things to unpick here, geographically, socially, ideas of traditional women's roles. And I think it'd be great to start the discussion with these factors and how you think they contribute to the printmaking world today.
Would you like me to maybe start off, because I had some ideas in researching this, and I was thinking a lot about not only women's place in art history, but then women's place within being a female and the sort of social structure of things over the last few hundred years, and access to process and mediums. And we were just discussing before we started the 2015-16 exhibition at the Rijksmuseum about women in print, and a lot of those artists that were exhibited were aristocratic or upper class women who had access to people to teach them. But at the same time, during those periods, those women would have just been seen as hobbyists, whereas women printing within the ateliers, maybe the family run printmaking studios, it was hard graft and it was grind, and they were artisans but not necessarily recognized as artists, and they were, you know, physically getting stuck into printing to make money, and again they wouldn't be recognized as artists. I guess in the 19th century, with the rise of a sort of middle class, educated class, and women going to art schools, again, it was only a few people that had access to that. But that's when maybe the shift was moving into recognizing women as makers. So,
yes, because I think before that as well, even earlier as well, it probably was considered like a trade. I mean, it's associated, like, if you think of engraving armor and things, you sort of people like metalworkers and goldsmiths, and I suppose it would be perceived as difficult skill and a labour and hard labour, and therefore obviously seen as sort of deemed a male activity. So I think stemming from that, and then going into what you were saying, there were shifts after that point. But I think, yeah, it generally, like most things, I suppose, were considered a male activity.
Mm-hmm. And also just the technical process as well was seen as quite male, because it sort of needed precision and like a kind of process of many steps. And I think that is like traditionally, you know, seen as a kind of male thing.
And the idea of men having careers and women not being recognized in careers, it might be in the back shop or something, but the idea that men could take on an apprenticeship and work up in their trade, either within an art studio, as you say, in the engravers, where printmaking sort of came from, armor engraving and things like that. People would work, men would work as apprentices and go into these trades, whereas you wouldn't really get apprenticeships with women necessarily.
Like I said, passing on from like father to son, and these kind of through the ages, passing on this kind of information through the male line, really.
I think vocation itself was seen as male. You know, the women weren't seen as, if in the background or at all, was, you know, much more of a domestic thing, and arguably until the First World War, where you had women working on the home front, it wasn't acceptable to even give a title. So if there was no title, regardless of whether or not you were doing the work, it was unrecognized.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, but I think it's printing has been acknowledged as a kind of huge printing industry. So that's more suitable for men. So yeah, physical demands obviously is a real entry barrier for women. So yeah, just naturally men dominated the printing world.
I wonder whether actually still on a commercial scale, it's still very male. I mean, a lot of women are making prints, but I mean the big sort of print studios, or maybe even like big digital inkjet printing studios, litho studios, whether the big sort of big print, not so much fine art, but big printing studios are probably more male still. And even when we look at now, big studios that are making work, I mean, you look through the ages, the ones that are written down, like Tile 17, like you talked about, a male sort of run. Even now you've got a Thumbprint Porpoise Press in London, which are great studios. I'm sure they have mixed gender staff, but they obviously are male. And there's been this line, when you look up on the internet, you struggle to see the kind of representation of studios that are run by women, and more are now. I mean, there are more people making, you know, working on their own studios and setting up and having strong female teams. I mean, around the world as well, like you've got Crown Point Press in San Francisco with Catherine Brown, who set that up in the 60s. I think it was quite a female-dominated kind of team. And then in South Africa, Gillian Ross, who's a master printer there, who works on William Kentridge prints as well. So I think there is a sort of, they are there, but I think often when you Google or look things up, but you always get the kind of these studios that maybe more male run.
Mm-hmm. And in my experience, just of printmaking over the last few years, I would say there tends to be more male technicians and in studios. Definitely, I mean there are female technicians, but there seems to be more male, definitely.
And going back to Yoonjung's point about the physicalities of printmaking, these first print presses in the 15th, 16th centuries were huge, great machines. They needed physical power behind them, and just the sort of nature generally dictates that it would probably be cheaper for these printmaking ateliers at the time to hire a man that had the strength behind them than women and children who had to do some terrible sort of laborious jobs in those times, but they could hire a big man to do that. And so it sounds really anti-feminist, but at the same time it's like maybe it was a physical thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, still we now need sometimes when the press is broken, so we are calling for some male technicians because it's too heavy, So it's just natural thing, apart from any feminism and things like that. But just actually the technical, just the heaviness of the equipment that's very hard to overcome for women. So.
And so moving on from, obviously there's a huge shift I found from male to female printmakers. Like I said to you before, I think all my friends that are artists all seem to be printmakers. And what do you believe are the reasons behind this shift? Do you think it's that advance in technology? Because there has been a drive for more women in print being in prominence. For example, like Rebecca Salter, director from the RA, is a printmaker. What do you think has driven this? Or even Lizzie starting an art fair completely based in print.
Yeah, so we felt that it was underrepresented in terms of just being an art form generally. Obviously, there are print fairs. I mean, we specialize in contemporary print specifically, and therefore we have a more balanced gender equality within the fair, simply because it's contemporary. And if we were a more historic fair, we'd probably have less, or we definitely have less recognized women artists. And I think there was a shift in technology. There's lots of mediums that people could be exposed to, more ways of having, I mean, I'm not a fine artist myself, but more ways of having the sort of instruments and the machinery within smaller spaces as well, which would give more people more access to things. And I think just emancipation generally, and women having access and education as well.
And I think it's important to also note the shift within printmaking as more into the fine art versus as a commercial medium. We're going to speak about this idea of the underdog, but there was that, printmaking was a tool. The machine was a source of output rather than expression. And I think as soon as we, as soon as the medium was kind of seen in its own right as something that could, be an extension of your arm, could be an extension of expression, we even start to see more color appear, less even narrative work, more experimental. And with that, there comes, ironically, that same patience, that same kind of attention to detail did lend itself. If there wasn't this restraint of, say, a quota of pamphlets being printed, of output needed, then those physicality restraints were also in a way lifted as well. So you didn't have to look at it so much in terms of the demands to get it out there. It was more to create something. And I think that's a very important shift in mentality that did come along as well, and opened things up in terms of accessibility and in terms of like gender equality within the art form.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Kristina. I think that's also opened the door to fine artists. In fine art world, there are already full of women artists. They can now do things with paint and print as well. So Trace Emin and my favorite Rebecca Salter, she is working as a painter and printmaker. So that's really just open the door and just expand the boundary of printmaking as a form of fine art. That's the other fact, I think.
Interestingly, on my current MA course, there was 13 females and 1 male. So that's quite interesting how it was so female dominated. I don't know.
Yeah, a lot.
Particularly, I can't put my finger on why exactly. But yeah.
So, I mean, I was interested, Jen, you were saying you've got a background in architecture.
Yeah.
So,
also quite male dominated. Yeah.
And there's also a number of artists within the fair who have, you know, different professions. Yoonjung, you're saying you've got an interior design background as well. And I was interested in the sort of history of the shifting of printmaking being able to take people from one profession experimentally into another as a printmaker. And so that might also be another reason why we're seeing more women take up printmaking. It might be a sort of natural progression from, say, architecture or another design process that they're just, it's experimenting, and you lead into other things. And
and for me as well, I think because architecture is quite a lot about drawing, and print offers so much scope for using that drawing sort of techniques and also digital techniques as well. So it's quite adaptable, and there's so many things you can do. It's, you know, and using photography, imagery, I mean, it gives you so much scope, I guess. So I guess that was what attracted me to it originally.
I wonder, have each of you were you each attracted directly to print from the outset of your artistic journey, or have each of you moved into it, like you say, with architecture and design? Is that the same for the rest of you?
I actually was in sculpture and did a lot of bronze sculpture specifically. So if you want to talk about male dominated industries, I think I've moved from one to the other. But it is interesting, like Jen, what you said as well, like now looking at the art schools, it does seem to be female dominated. So I think time is a huge factor. Like the idea of contemporary art and the art coming out now is more equal because of accessibility to education, to this kind of, you know, it has to start from somewhere. So we're just kind of getting to the point where the scales are shifting. And oddly enough as well, in terms of bronze, you had, you know, the big ateliers as well. It was all very male dominated, but our team with the mold making, the kind of prototyping, and the design aspects of sculptures, they were entirely female. And then the men still did, you know, the pouring, the casting, the patina, and everything that involved kind of literal molten fire was still in a way very delegated. And I did find that interesting. So coming into print as well, there's definitely a trend that you could see. But I think what's so incredible about such shifts is that I think print is incredibly versatile. You know, it's, maybe this is what you were saying, Mollie, about this idea of the underdog. And I don't think it was so much an underdog, but it was so translatable that you had kind of painters using prints, sculptors using prints, architects using prints. You know, I think we have cyanotypes because they needed a way to copy a blueprint in a way amongst, you know, its uses in botany, throughout science, even photography itself. And then of course, journalism with the printing press, dissemination of information. So in fact, it was just this tool that was so used across everything as a way of dispersal that it wasn't seen as anything unique, which I think now with contemporary print, we are starting to see more unique pieces, more print installations. You know, people are starting to stretch it and to shift, and even to make works that are photographic or entirely painterly in a way, you know, like monoprints. You couldn't tell if they were paintings or not, other than the fact that they're on paper versus canvas. And there's a huge shift in the mentality towards what is it capable of. As opposed to something that was used more for utilitarian purpose or for, you know, being more economic, collectible, as opposed to the original. But with that, I also think it's incredibly democratizing, And if you have something that is meant, say, for the masses in terms of print, of its dissemination, then you also have a means of higher accessibility. You know, it was never seen as a luxury of something of the aristocrats. Once we kind of get past, you know, the 15th century, it was seen as something else. And that, I think, paved the way for both it to be a trade and an art, or at least it catalyzed it, I think is what I'm trying to say.
Kristina, thank you for that. I think that was an excellent lead into our next point as well. But I think you're right. I think the idea that printmaking as a whole is an umbrella term, isn't it, for so many things, like you say, for so many different trades, things you don't even, I never even thought about the botany side of it with cyanotypes, but it's so true. It's encompassed everything. So if we can go into a bit more about that and about this history of it being like, I keep using the word underdog, but the underdog of the artwork, because I think even now people see it as almost lesser than, say, painting or sculpture. And we've had a really great comment come through on the Q&As. He says, as a woman, print is very attractive to me because it is such a challenging medium. There's very little place to hide in print in terms of mistakes, changes of mind, or incorrect registration. It's not like a painting where I can paint over it or change my mind. What would you guys respond to that?
Well, that's really pertinent to what all these artists are trying to say and produce as well. It is technical. I mean, Kristina was saying about the versatility of printmaking, but it's so technical, you don't see, I mean, what's really exciting about it, and that we try to demonstrate at the fair, usually with these demonstrations and things, and live sort of print making opportunities, it's that reveal. You don't know if you've created what you set out to create until you've revealed it. Whereas if you're there watching the canvas or the forms coming from your sculpture, you can manipulate it in a way, but it isn't until you see the finished product with print that you know it's a complete surprise. And I think that's very telling as well.
Yeah, and that's some of the magic about it, really. You know, have that magical moment where the reveal, as you say, and then you don't know if you've done what you hoped. Sometimes you've exceeded what you hoped, and sometimes you're really disappointed. And so, yeah.
Always that area for serendipity, things that, you know.
Yeah, and you can make amazing things and you didn't realise, and accidentally, yeah.
Even the making editions is really tough things to make, totally identical things or always raw. So it's always revealing is quite eccentric. So.
Yes, because they're kind of original things. There's lots of originals, really, not just a copy, is that you're kind of hand printing every single one.
Yeah, I think we were going to talk about like sort of the shift in male and female. Mollie, you were going to ask about the geographical natures as well and how women are seen through.
Beat me to it.
Oh, okay, sorry.
No, that's fine. Go, please.
I'm just reading the questions here, and Mollie was thinking about how the approach of women in print and women printmakers differs around the world. So, and how cultures differ in regards to printmaking and women printmakers. Well, I had some notes that I wrote, and actually you might challenge me on this, but I was thinking about the sort of geographical notions of what people considered artists and artisans. So if you look at East Asia and Central Asia, the sort of pattern that always came from the pattern that comes out of these countries, people were celebrated for creating these patterns, and women would create patterns for fabrics and art over centuries, and they were celebrated artisans, whereas the people maybe in the West that were creating pattern, and my background is as a fashion curator, so I've got a sort of background in textile history and fashion history. In the West, maybe it was considered more of a lowly profession. You were printing textiles as a trade, whereas I think in the Central and Eastern Asia, it was a celebrated, beautiful practice. Maybe that's an easier, well, maybe not easier, but a different shift for women artisan to artist.
It's also interesting. I think there's a big difference in the East and the West, and in terms of the West and Indigenous, because so my background is in print, but it's also in bookbinding, and you see it as it's much more communal, but it's something that it's akin to textiles. It takes that time, there's that pattern, and there's also the sewing, and that was always done together. And it was then predominantly female in a sense, because you would sit around and you would do it, and you know, you were sewing these stories and you were preserving, so you had a very important kind of role to play, and this oral storytelling kind of always recurred, and it was a way to keep things alive. And then it wasn't always, in fact, books. They could have been scrolls, they could have been images, but it was the act itself that created or preserved the culture, and that was very much responsibility of, say, who was doing the binding, who was telling the story, and that tended to be more female orientated as well.
It does seem that also there's obviously specific roles, and there's a hierarchy even within the printing system. A lot in the West, thinking of Japanese woodblock printing, you've got the kind of artist who'd make the design, but they wouldn't then print the print. There'd be a cutter who would cut, and then someone would pass it on to someone that would print the work, and then there'd be a publisher. And so within, even that was predominantly male, I think, but even with that, there's like a hierarchy, that the artist was then the one that had the idea and the vision, but then the printer would be more like the craftsman that would then help produce it.
Amy, perfect that you've asked that, because we've actually had a question through just saying that during the history of print, the practice of printmaking has often involved, you know, a divided process, like you say. And as printers, how important do you think it is to be involved in the entire process of printmaking?
I actually find that quite intriguing and an interesting part of it, to understand the technical aspects, because as we said before, sometimes mistakes can lead to new things that you haven't thought of. So I think doing the whole process can move your practice on, and can kind of develop your practice. So for me, I think it's quite important to do all. But I guess if you were a very famous artist, you'd have someone doing everything for you, like a factory almost.
Yeah, I think it depends. Some people that are obviously interested in more the idea of their work sometimes than getting involved in the process. I think we all love printmaking, so we love the process, we love physically doing it. But there are people that come to work that are maybe painters or sculptors that don't necessarily want to know the nitty-gritty about how you actually physically make that or etch that. They just want their imagery translated. And I suppose that when they'd come to work in studios, then we'd work with a printmaker who takes that technical stuff away, and it's just more about them making their work. So I suppose then they can be more removed in a way, and there's always that kind of mystique around that when people work in studios, they may not physically actually produce the work, but it was their hand in making the matrix, or deciding on the colours, but then a printer would then help facilitate that for them.
Yeah, and also I'm always looking for some balancing point between artistic point of view and technical point of view. But the printmaking is very experimental in a way. So I really enjoy that, some process and techniques, and also some art, just as a fine art. So I really enjoyed that process as well.
And I think because printmaking shares this history of being both kind of commercial and fine art, there's always going to be such an element of collaboration. And I mean, even within printmaking, there's so many processes that there's not going to be one person who knows them all. So in that sense, you're always going to be working with someone, whether or not it's an artist or another specialist, or even say a paper specialist, because you need to do something, you know, it needs to function in a different way. You're always going to have, you know, that's why there are print houses. Like you'll always have a few people working on something, and very rarely it's like you and your art in this kind of sole studio stereotype. It's not, it doesn't quite function that way. And I think that's part of the magic, and I think that's part of why a lot of us are drawn to it. And I think because of that, like you would see it on older pieces, even say engravings for catalogs, for example. On one side you see the draftsman, and on the other side you would see the printer. On the back, the plate maker was stamped. You know, you always saw this evidence of how many people it took to make this process. And I mean, I think for anyone who appreciates art, like the printing part of it, is part of the magic as well. Like you take that with you.
I think that cross-pollination between all these multidisciplinary things is what makes print exciting, and I think it will be key to its survival. I mean, to embrace these new technologies and carry on with a kind of really strong tradition in the old, you know, the old craft of it, and then being able to move through other sort of new media and things like that. That's what attracts people, and I think that's what will keep it going in an exciting way that will always attract people to keep making prints.
And Catherine Oliver, who's a great friend of the fair, she's an art dealer and a curator for Oliver Projects. She's made a really interesting point. I think there is something about the ritual inherent in printmaking practice that is attractive to women artists who are juggling a family and work. Maybe the structure and process aspect helps them find some order in their busy lives. Men often don't have this struggle and have to multitask in the same ways, which is an really interesting point.
I can relate to that as a mum of 2 children. Yeah, I think it does give you some kind of order, some control over something. Although I do have a very supportive husband, actually. But yeah, I can definitely relate to that.
I think it's definitely having that sort of brain as well, that you kind of work in layers, and it's just the way you see things and can break things down.
And Jack, who's the director of the fair, he's my husband. He enjoys the social aspect of printmaking. When he's in his own studio painting, it's very by himself. He's in his own thoughts, but when he's in the printmaking studio, there's that sort of, so other people are there, and you're talking and you're revealing at the same time, and you're getting this sort of bounce back from other artists. Is that something that you guys relate to?
I think it's like what Kristina said about the idea of that creative collaboration. I think that really inspires, and it kind of feeds back in. And I think people that then come out of their kind of solitary practice to work in a group then go back, and what they've learned is kind of pushes them in different directions they might have gone in had they just been left to their own devices. Even just in kind of cooperative settings where you kind of you're working, using a shared space, just rubbing off each other ideas and stuff, and then you go home and then your work changes and it pushes it forward. So I think there's a lot that goes back from having worked, and particularly us I've worked with, I know that have started making prints and never really made any before, and then gone back and carried on painting, and their painting has changed by what they've learned through making prints.
And I think printmaking as well, I think you see it more so than in painting or sculpture, because there is a time factor. You know, once you do a layer, if you're drawing, or if you're, you know, even waiting for someone to aquatint or to etch and to bite, and you know, or you're processing a litho, you need to sit there and wait, and you consider. And being in such a contemporary set, or such a collaborative setting, or an open space, you know, it's very natural to look over and to see what someone's doing, and the ideas are always going to flow, because you also have people that are inherently so interested in what everyone else is doing, because we're quite fascinated with the process, you know. Like once you get obsessed, I think you do get obsessed with it.
And a large part of it, sometimes it's a lot of it's problem solving with printmaking. So figuring that out with like more than one mind makes everything easier.
Absolutely.
And so has that been, for each of you, has that been your experience, this highly collaborative process, and also one that you're learning all the time?
Yeah, I think for me, and I am newer to printmaking as well, I think it's hugely important just to feed off other people and their ideas, and something, the process as well. All of that does feed into your own practice, and kind of, yeah, it makes you think about different things you hadn't even thought of before. So I think it's definitely hugely important. Yeah, for me as well.
I do a lot of collaboration within my work, not just being in the studio, but I really enjoy collaborating with other artists. And so recently I did a collaboration with a photographer, Itamar Fried, and one of the pieces are in the print show now. And what I find really interesting, and we've kind of touched on it, is that you do realize when you work with others that you see in different ways. So like printmakers definitely see in layers, and I think more so we'll see in layers of like black, or layers of etching and times, and as soon as you have to be reminded that there are other mediums in a way. And I remember once we were looking you know, we looked up from each other and we're like, you see this image completely different than I see it. You know, one has seen it in colors and tones, and I'm literally only seen it in the number of like films we have to make and times and exposures. And, you know, it's quite funny to see that there are two brains at work and what that can do and create. And I think what's amazing when that happens is that you can always kind of see, you know, parts from each artist. And then when, you know, even when I bring that into my individual practice, I can definitely tell that, you know, my mentality has shifted a bit, or I'm considering different nuances, or, you know, you're just more open to it, and you kind of think about things a little bit differently. And I really, really like that. I think it only adds to your practice.
That's fascinating. I love this idea of it being so collaborative, and really, really, like you say, bringing new ways of viewing things. We've had a really interesting question, which I was curious about earlier, and it's, how does the panel feel about giclée prints as an experience? Oh, as in my experience, the general public often don't appreciate the difference between digital print and handmade prints, and pieces are often similar. What would be your reaction to that, and the idea about giclée prints in, you know, in contrast to hand done prints?
So within the fair, it's quite a controversial question sometimes, especially we do have often questions from in the more traditional process, the more traditional history of printmaking, ask us why we accept giclée print. For us, an original print is something conceived as a print in the first instance. And as we were saying earlier, this sort of technical shift, technical processes are always going to shift and adapt. So we see it as, you know, it's an original print form if it's in that, you know, if it's been produced in with this concept in mind, and it's, you know, on that journey through, you know, technical evolution and things like that. So I mean, it can be quite a controversial question for a print fair, but we accept giclée applications. But as we try and give as much information around the different printmaking processes as possible. So there is a tab on our website called About Print, and hopefully it's a quite accessible and palatable way to learn about different printmaking techniques. So I'd encourage people to go and look at that as well.
I think there's always that, I mean, however you want to make your work and what you want your work to say, I suppose you choose the media to suit. But I think there's always that misconception with print and people that don't really understand what goes into printmaking, the various processes. I think, I mean, I know even for my family, just knowing that I'm a printer, half of them probably think I just sit at the printer and just press print. I mean, I don't know whether they really know actually what goes into making a print. And I think for people that aren't necessarily as involved in the art world, knowing actually how things are made, I think there's that would be the frustration, I suppose, seeing the giclée print. Sometimes it literally can be a painting that is just printed exactly like a facsimile, exactly the same. So I think there's more, I still think there's more to do to make people aware of what prints are and how they're made, and the appreciation that goes with that. Otherwise, that's why I think print then can be demoted into the fact that it is just a reproductive process rather than an artistic one.
But going back to what Lizzie said, I do think it's a valid form of printmaking, digital print, as long as that's how it's conceived. It's like it is the original kind of thing. It was only meant to be a digital print, then I think it's a valid form of printmaking. But obviously very different in terms of technical expertise, you know, that you need to be able to create it.
And obviously the fair is here to sort of challenge people's preconceptions, as Amy Jane was saying just a second ago, that printmakers are just sitting by the computer printing off prints is completely wrong and incorrect. The whole idea of the fair is to challenge these preconceptions and educate and bring new approaches to printmaking and the versatility and the breadth of what it can be and what it can do. And part of that is looking at these sort of new or collaborative processes. But it was something that we specify is that we're not showing reproductions of other artworks. They're, you know, the remit is original, conceived originally. So that's back to Jen's point. Yeah.
but the good thing is we are now combined with the kind of a digital media like photopolymer and things. Now we transfer the image to our metal plate or some old block and anything. And now it's trend is changing and also open the new territory for printmaking. So sometimes it's really positive to think about digital media and what is the thing genuine print.
There's actually an interesting question along the same lines, but looking at the processes from Tara Chittenden to the panelists that said, what do the panelists think? And I think it's more relevant to the artists here. The digital tools that take the place of previously hand-skilled processes. For example, the use of CNC laser cutting to cut wood blocks. And then there's another question about where we go to locate print. But maybe we could go into maybe one of you'd like to sort of take on that question about the sort of, i.e. the laser cutting as opposed to hand cutting.
I think it's a technical process, and we've said that from the start. And I think you have to acknowledge that technology is going to jump in leaps and bounds, and it has. So there is this dichotomy in print that it's traditional, but we're also saying it's so experimental, it's so open. So, you know, I think that has to include technology in a way. So even be it from photographic processes or reprographic processes to say wood cutting and laser cutting and engraving with CNC milling, you know, it's out there, and imagine what it could do in a way. Like, can it not push forward or even in a way kind of add to? And then by that extension say, you know, maybe we don't need to spend our entire lives apprenticing for one thing, but we can focus on the image or on the concept. We can move in again out from this output and into the art of it, and that can be a huge help. Like I did a masterclass at the DNA kind of about alternative imagery, and one of the means was using laser cutting for wood blocks, and how that could then really speed up an original book cover or box set, or, you know, how that could help in terms of an archive, or even then it was in conjunction with the Balenciaga exhibition at the time. So like how you can then take the softness of fabric and translate it using kind of digital imagery, going through time, through medium, even through kind of subject matter, in order to then get down to the meaning, to what you want to say in a new, exciting way that also becomes something in and of itself. And the difference between then, if something digital, like something that was mechanically engraved, being printed by hand. And I've also seen, like I've done a few sculptures up in Edinburgh that we used laser engraving to kind of embed into sculptures and into monuments, because it was something that then, it was precise and it was very kind of felt, and it's warm because it's still wood cut and you're able to use the plates. And I think that's a huge kind of interest for some people, is that the printmaking plate is always so interesting, and it's for the first time a way to even addition a plate. And it, you know, there's lots of versatility in it. And I think it's exciting, but it's maybe not quite as explored yet. And that's what's great about it in a way as well.
Just progress, isn't it? I think if your image needs that and the idea drives it, it's exciting. You can find different ways of achieving things. And sometimes, like you said, Kristina, you don't just slave over things that you might have done, and then you can give more time to other areas. I think, yeah, it's just how things are moving forward.
I think it's just another tool as well in the toolkit for printmaking. And I think it depends what your intention for your image is. I mean, it doesn't mean that you can't do handwood engraving, because maybe that process is embedded in the concept of your work or something like that. But then it doesn't mean to say you can't do laser engraving isn't valid either. You know, it's just another way of working with the medium. So, and I totally agree, you know, things move on and you have to continually experiment and push the boundaries and, you know, see what you can make. You know, we're all makers, aren't we?
It also extends accessibility for printmaking as well, doesn't it? Like you say, carving the wood panels was inaccessible to you. It increases that accessibility for other people to get involved in print who maybe wouldn't have been able to, like we were saying, like 200 years ago, with the physical demands of it. It increases that as well, which I think is really important. Do each of you have any comments about what you think the future of printmaking holds? Kristina, you've spoken quite a lot about this, you know, how it's progressing and how this technology is going to really, really help. Do you have any kind of ideas of where you think it might be going?
I think we have seen a kind of resurgence in print lately, not just with the idea of print-specific fairs, which has never been seen before, but even going through the archives, you know, it's something that has up till now preserved, and now we can look back at things, we can look back at this skill and also then kind of move forward, and we see it throughout kind of so many mediums, this hold on print. And people, I think, instead of that being something to delegate it or kind of create a subset of other industries, they're seeing this versatility as a strength and as something to be celebrated in a way. And it is interesting, like I just said very briefly, about we're seeing more and more this engraving and sculpture, which does in a way harken back to, say, engraved armor, right? So it's not like something is wildly changing, but the mentality is changing towards it, that this is something to be pushed, to be expanded, to maybe take on a three-dimensionality, and how versatile it is. You know, you're even seeing like etched glass with more design work, you know, so it's making its way into the design world, animated kind of prints as well, a way to give a great amount of kind of sensitivity or you know, a different aesthetic, a different feel. You know, so we do see it time and time again. We see it in fashion, we see it in textiles, and I think it's growing, and people are starting to really kind of see it more as identifying it as print, not identifying it as, oh, this is a fabric, no, this is a print, you know, or this is a sculpture, it is also a print. So I think it's just, you know, like Amy Jane's been saying, it's this progress, you know, and it's as soon as people start to see it within its own right, and photography took the same kind of pivot as well, you know, it was seen as a form of documentation, of recreation, and then, you know, art form in and of itself. And so I think while we'll always have this idea that print can facilitate other things, it can also, it is because of that facilitation or because of that versatility that it's really growing, and it's really kind of going into all different industries at the same time.
And its beauty is its multiplicity too, because the fact that you can print editions and more than one of things, so things it's so democratic, can be seen by a large range of people all at the same time, and it offers people to almost then obviously can collect and buy and afford them more. And I think just that dissemination is also really important.
And I think I was going to say it. I think as well, it's just another kind of medium an artist can use. You know, there are lots of female artists I like would use it, but also maybe a sculptor or a painter as well, or a drawer. But it can be an equally valid form of just an expressive form. So you can you don't just have to be a printmaker. You can come in and out and use it when you think it suits your work or the project. You know, so it's not. It's quite interesting seeing people just established artists using it as just another form of expression.
Yeah,
question. So Carol Weiss, who on this sort of the future of print in a way, what does the panel think about print and installation? So Carol has exhibited print installation at the fair. She has obviously it's online this year, but the tall installation in the center of the exhibition is a Carol Weiss piece. And a couple of years ago, you would have seen the printed cubes that were sort of cascading at one end. So Carol has a very interactive approach to printmaking and installation. So it'd be interesting to know, in terms of the future of printmaking, what your opinions are.
Yeah, I think it's a truly exciting time for printmaking, and in terms of diversity. So by technique-wise and things like, so that's really good progress for printmaking to make more accessible and more affordable. So maybe it attracts more audience and more artists to try from their main role, and they sometimes shift to print to experiment with. So that's really exciting.
And I do think we are seeing this shift into unique pieces. You know, print is a way of getting an image on a substrate, and the ability, or like how versatile that is. Like we've seen time and time again, that doesn't just mean paper, and how then you can manipulate whatever you choose into installation, into kind of freestanding form that in and of itself is going to be exciting to more than just printmakers. And that doesn't mean that, you know, print installation, I think it's phenomenal because it says so much, you know, it just says that it can't actually be limited, you know, and we're seeing it develop, cascade, scroll, hang, you know, it's amazing.
I agree with everything you said. It's an exciting kind of time, isn't it, when you can push print into 3D, into installation, and see what you can do with it. And that's what really excites me about the future of printmaking, definitely.
That's fantastic. I think before we open up to more questions from the audience, I was just interested what if you guys are working on anything specifically going forward in printmaking, and also who your favourite contemporary printmakers are. It's quite a difficult one, it's quite broad. Apart from each other, obviously.
Well, since I'm not the artist, I'll quickly say, well, we're obviously promoting the fair and promoting printmaking as a medium. And I think I mentioned before our chat, my favorite, well, so many, but a couple of my favorite printmakers, Paula Rego, I'm a massive fan. Actually, my first print was a Paula Rego print when I was 15, and that kind of set the ball rolling on my sort of passion. And then I really love the work by artist, a New York-based artist called Ida Applebrug, who I would recommend you look up. She's got some really interesting pieces about her time in a mental health institution, and it's really fascinating and tells a really great story. So, and then I'll hand over to you guys now.
I think one of my kind of favorite, there are so many, but I really enjoy, you know, Julie Maratu and Cornelia Parker, Kathy Pilkinson, and you know, they're not just printmakers, which I think I really like the fact that it's so much in their practice, but it's not seen as a delineation of their practice, and I think that kind of speaks to the ethos of this chat and how it is an exciting time for printmaking, in terms of where it's going and how it's being perceived in kind of art, or fine art, in the greater sphere of things.
And that's what's inspiring as a printmaker. I think when people like sculptors and things come in to make prints, and seeing how they approach things then kind of reinvigorates and inspires kind of our practice as printmakers as well to carry on. And because how they're using like those beautiful prints that Cornelia's just done, they do the glass dark, beautiful photopolymers where they've actually used the glasses she's collected. And I mean, there's that kind of always that print geek side of me that is technically so beautifully printed and made, and then there's also that appreciation that this kind of like you said, it doesn't delineate from her practice. It's very much using these found objects she kind of has collected.
Yeah.
But that's sort of, yeah, that beautiful transition into making them into works. It just makes total sense.
And also Rachel Whiteread's another example where, you know, he has a wider sculpture practice, but then she's done some lovely screen prints also about sort of, the bottom of bottles and things like that. And yeah, they are really beautiful.
And we touched on Rebecca Salter, I think, whether it's before we went online, I'm not sure. But again, she's really beautiful because I think her work, again, sort of transcends this printmaking process because they've become such beautiful things. It's not just this sort of object, it's going to build up of these layers and ephemeral layers and monoprint and things as well. I think her work seen as a print becomes becomes kind of something else. It's not just about that printing process.
And also, I think in terms of Rebecca's thought, it's really interesting to go back to the future of printmaking and the fact that the RA has, Rebecca's thought is now heading up the RA, which is really not only a woman, but a printmaker. So that's really a really interesting point.
And it's really nice actually think with her, particularly her prints as well. She's kind of carrying on that respect for that tradition, having lived in Japan, and she's working directly with colours there to kind of keep that going, keep that tradition of cutting colour, because these things like that are starting to die out. But I think there's resurgence in education and trying to get people to carry that on and learn these old skills. So I think there's a nice kind of relationship there between this kind of contemporary and also keeping the tradition of the old techniques going.
Yeah, Rebecca Sauter is my favorite female printmaker as well. But she really elegantly combines the Western and Eastern beauty in very abstract way. So that is amazing. Yeah, she is always my favorite.
Fantastic. I think we're ready to open up to audience Q&A, unless anyone had anything else they just wanted to add. No? So if anyone has any questions, please do type them. I'm not sure if we'll be able to hear you or not to know how that works. We should see them come in on the Q&A part.
There's Robert Bush. Jen Moore's point about artists in other media using printmaking is very well illustrated by the Brazilian sculptor Ana Maria Pacheco, whose print oeuvre is significant in itself. And interestingly, she was one of my points of discussion in my Curator tour, because Pratt Contemporary are exhibiting a series of her work at the moment at the fair. So do go online and go to Pratt's booth and have a look at Pacheco's work. It's really fascinating. So that was a point as opposed to it. Does anyone want to discuss that?
Give it a few more minutes for questions. Well, I was going to say about Eileen Cooper being involved in Woolwich and also obviously in the Royal Academy, and like you're saying, these incredible artists of prominence are, huge printmakers, and I think that's really, really exciting to see.
Yeah, and she works with Blackbird Editions. I know Sarah Lee and Julia Painter work with her to make her prints, again with a all-female kind of print workshop, which is really cool.
And I think what is exciting is, like, as soon as you start looking with this in mind, with the idea of what artists use print as a form of expression, you start to uncover that it's just actually so predominant, and it's just shedding a light on this, time and time again. We do start to see that print is everywhere. It's just been a bit shadowed, and now is kind of the time where it's being uncovered. And I think that's what makes it so exciting, is that it's just coming to light, and to see that it has been done time and time again, and has been combined and kind of used to elevate other parts of practices, but then has really kind of informed it as well over time.
I agree, we're living in such an exciting time, aren't we, for printmaking? So it's really nice to be able to have this discussion.
Sorry, I think there's just one more question in the chat that I don't think we've covered. It's they were talking about the digital tools, and where do panelists locate print? Is it in the design or the image, or in the physical making of the block or plate, or in the transfer of the ink, or in all three?
I think it's in all three.
I agree.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Which is what makes it so interesting, it's got all these layers of the process.
I feel like there's consideration at every stage, isn't there? But there is that point where you have to make that commitment. You get to that reveal.
And a question here from Kate Desforges, who's also exhibiting at the fair. Have you found it difficult to access facilities during lockdown, and has that changed your process or practice at all?
question.
Yeah, because I don't have my own studio, so I try to something at home. So some kind of magazines or some different things I tried to make plates, and lockdown definitely affected my practice.
We've got another question from Tori McLean. Would WCPF consider showing print plates alongside the open prints? As when clients come into the studio, I find they are always amazed to see the plate itself and the effort taken to make the matrix. So we have shown plates in the past. Some people have put plates in as their application piece. We also obviously have generally we have the etching presses or the screen prints, and all the physical aspects of making print is there in front of the exhibition, so people can engage with the physical and the sort of technical and know a bit more about how the pieces on the wall are made. So yeah, we do consider showing print plates, and we have in the past. Thank you for that question.
I think people love to see them, don't they, like the behind the scenes of the print, because I think even people don't understand exactly what goes behind it, which is what we've been saying.
Yeah. I mean, should we? I think there's another chat, and then maybe it's been an hour, so we might have to round it up maybe.
Yes, if no one has any other questions or comments, I just want to say thank you all for being here, and the audience as well, but also all our panelists. I think it's been really, really fascinating. It's gone very quick, the hour.
It's been really quickly, and we're so privileged to have you here, Mollie, and for you championing the fair and the women artists in it. There's a lovely sorry, not a question, more of a quote from Kate Desforges in the private chat. I've been so, and Kate is showing, I've been so lucky to have been taught and inspired by so many amazing women in the print world. Karen and Kristina at Intaglio Printmaker, which is, for those that don't know, it's Intaglio Printmakers in Southwark, and it's where a lot of printmakers go to get their tools. Karen and Kristina at Intaglio Printmaker, Serena Smith and all the women team at Leicester Print Workshop, and at WYPW, so many women printmakers who have come to run courses and be involved in exhibitions. Anne Desmet, Amy Jane Blackhall, Sumi Pereira, Danielle Creenan, Michelle Keegan, Sue Baker Kenton. It's a real privilege. So thank you for that, Kate. A lot of those artists are showing with us as well this year. So please go and have a look at the fair from in a new light, I think. So yeah, thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Anything finally?
I think that women often have a very kind of nurturing environment. I think lots of women working together, and the West Yorkshire Print Workshop, where Kate's from too, there's lots of big groups of people that get together in this community. But I think something about women teaching other women and that community spirit, and like it's the nurturing and nurturing nature of this creative collaboration, I think goes hand in hand as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for all of you joining us. And again, thank you to Mollie, and also to Lauren, who behind the scenes has just created fantastic content and has helped facilitate this panel. So we're very grateful to Lauren as well. And I think we'll say bye now, and then for anyone, do share it on your platforms, and it will be available to watch on our website in the programs section. So please do share it. I think people will find it really interesting. Okay, thank you. Bye.
Bye.
All right.